In today's video, I'm going to cover a few different ways to put a bottom into both mitered boxes or box joint slash finger joint boxes. Tool-wise, we've got table saw blade, a rabbeting bit, ideally one with bearing adjustability. I don't have one of those, but we'll talk about how you would use it. Some kind of straight bit or a spiral bit, preferably. A plunge router, table saw, or router table. Now this is only power tool based. I don't really use a lot of hand tools, and especially not for this. So we're just going to cover a few power tool methods now. And we'll get into the box joints first because I think that's the more complicated one for a lot of people, especially as we get to smaller pieces and conversely larger pieces. Now one of the conundrums with box joints is that you don't want some kind of gap showing through here. Unlike a miter, we can't just run this along the table saw, run it along the router table, or else you're going to have to, at the end, plug up some kind of square hole here. It's not going to look as good. You're never going to grain match so well that it disappears. Trust me, I know. So what we have to do is some sort of stop cut. And we have to stop it inside of the fingers on all of the sides so that when we place everything together and assemble the box, there is nothing showing on the outside. This gets a little tricky. For me, this is a router table or plunge router operation. It really just depends on the size. For something smaller, I usually go for the router table. And then for something too large for the router table, I go to the plunge router. We'll walk through both of those. We'll start with the router table first. Now, when we are at the router table doing the box joints, we're essentially going to be doing a plunge cut of sorts onto a fixed router bit instead of mobile. We'll also show you the mobile option a little later. But when we're using really tiny pieces, we can't just grab this big router and go over it. We need a table and we can manipulate the piece itself. So for doing this, it's really going to help if you have a spiral bit, up cut or down cut. It doesn't really matter because we're plunging. If you don't and all you have is a straight bit, you're going to need some kind of drill bit that can remove a middle section so that we can still plunge onto this. Now that isn't the hardest thing in the world, just requires an extra step. We obviously need to get our fence here and then some kind of stop blocks. Now depending upon the fence you have, this may limit the size you can do. And this is what just is the overall limiting factor, is how far back we can set these stop blocks for the length of our plunge. The first thing we need to do is the layout. You're going to need one of each pieces. We don't need to mark out everything. We just need one end and one long ways, and then we're going to need our base material. Now there's a couple things we have to know here. How deep we want to go in the groove, which will then determine how far into the fingers we have to go, and how wide your material is. Now for me, I only have a 1/4 inch spiral bit as my smallest, so this is a minimum of a 1/4 inch. It's just, I can't go any smaller. I don't have a smaller bit. If you prefer to use some kind of thinner material, you're gonna have to get a thinner bit. Now I personally love to float my lids off from the bottom. That means I need to leave some kind of chunk down here at the bottom that is thick enough, and I like at minimum a 1/16, but 3/32 is really what I like. And I like to use this Incra guide right here to draw these. I don't have to sit there with a ruler and do too much. So I've got my baseline going 3/32, and I'm going to put that on both sides here. Now, I also like going 1/4 inch or so in as a groove. That gets me enough kind of room in there for the base to sit in, but I'm not wasting time taking out too much material because we have to do this in a couple of plunges. So what this means is if we want to go a 1/4 inch down, we have to then cut out a 1/4 inch from either end of this piece. Our plunge line has to start a 1/4 inch and end a 1/4 inch in. That way, when we do this mating guy, which is going to be a 1/4 inch deep, and it slots together, it will be perfectly a 1/4 inch all the way around. And this is where this gets a little tricky and you have to be a little careful. So the first thing I do is I just come to the very end of my finger here and I just go a 1/4 inch. Sometimes you can go a little over, it doesn't really matter. We cut the base to fit afterwards. Now you're just gonna carry that up however thick your line is. Because I have a 1/4 inch router bit, I just marked out a bit of a 1/4 inch here, even though the plywood I'm going to demonstrate with is a little thinner. You need to mark out however thick you are going in terms of the thickness of your base, and this line will carry up that high. Now, once we've got this marked out, it's going to really help do some kind of tear out prevention if you have an X-Acto knife or a marking knife, and we're just going to score this line right here. This is a little delicate, especially when your fingers literally on the box joints are thinner. It gets a little delicate, but we're going to score this so that when we plunge in, it's not going to cause tear out. If you do it too fast or try to go too deep, you can just blow these fingers right out the back, and you can't recover from that. So go to both sides and give it a good score line there, just like you would do with any other marking knife. If you want to use a marking gauge and mark out these lines, you can, but I've never had any problem with blowing either side of that out. We leave this a little thick just to give it some extra strength. You know, that's why I like a minimum of 1/16, but preferably 3/32 on this bottom here to create a nice lip. Now, the next thing we're going to do is for lining this up and visually, we got to think about which way we're plunging. Now, I always plunge with the base facing the router table, because then if I need to go bigger, I'm moving this back and the router bit is taking out the material the way it would like. If we went the other way, we'd essentially be doing a climb cut all the way through. So we want to have it so that our initial point is going to be facing back. And I will demonstrate this at the router table. So once you've got one side done, you will repeat this same process on your smaller side, unless you're making a square, in which case you only need to do it once. And that way we have our essentially template for setting things up, and we don't have to do any marking out or thinking with the other side. It carries in between fingers. That's totally fine. Some people like to set the base up between fingers, and that's fine, but I'm often using a base thickness that is not matching all that well with my fingers, so I don't worry about that. So go ahead and we're going to carry it through there. That's okay. We don't have to be lined up perfectly with the inside of either of these. We mark out our 1/4 inch, make it a little heavy if you want, and go slightly over. Score the line again. Just make sure this is nicely scored. We want those top fibers severed. It's really, really going to help that we have no tear out here. Now at this point, if you are using a straight bit, you are going to now need to drill your pilot holes, and you're going to line them up right here at the very end, where we will be plunging and then plunging out, unplunging, whatever you call it. So take a bit equivalent to the thickness of take a drill bit equivalent to the thickness of your router bit and line it up such that the outside edge is exactly on your line, and drill this out down to the depth that you want. Therefore, we can come down onto this bit, whereas normally you can't come down onto these because there's no cutter in the middle there. You just kind of run into it. It gets very awkward. You can sort of finagle it. Not a good idea. So make sure to drill this out if you are using a straight bit. And again, be careful when you're drilling this out not to have any tear out. Just make sure your line is scored. Once we've got our two pieces marked, we can now head to the router table and set this up. The first thing we need to do here is decide on our reducer plate size. The smaller your piece is, the more at risk you get of tipping in. However, the bigger the hole is, the better dust collection you get, or the less dust that's going to collect up here because it can fall down. I would suggest using the biggest one you have without risking tipping in there. This is a little tight for me. Anything bigger than this, and I'd be okay using this reducer ring, but I'm going to swap this out for the middle ground one. Once we've got the reducer ring in there, we're going to zero out our router bit. This is going to help us get to a 1/4 inch if you have this capability. If not, just begin by getting it flush with the table. You may not have this above the table option, but you can still do this with a ruler afterwards. Just start by getting it flush with the top here. Now for alignment, we're going to raise this up about 1 inch, though our initial cut is going to be much shallower. It just helps to have the bit a little higher to do the initial lineup. Now the first thing we need to do is set the fence distance. Now like I said, I cut with this facing in, and then to make it wider, I move the fence back. So I just essentially eyeball this. You can use measuring tape, you can use a ruler, a spacer block, something like that. We just need it for the purposes of this 3/32 away. It really helps. Make sure your router's unplugged to align this bit so that the cutter head is directly 90 degrees to the fence, so we know exactly how far back. Now that seems right. One way you can test this is by just pressing this down on there, and you can then look for the little marks, and that's close enough for me. I'll leave it at that. Now because I have dust collection that pulls under, I like to close these all the way. Those of you who are only sucking out the back, you may want to leave these open a little bit, but 99% of the dust should be going down. We actually don't want it building up anywhere else, or it's going to get in the way of our plunge, and every time we want to plunge, we're going to have to be blowing dust out of the way. So ideally, you have these closed. You don't have to, but ideally you do. Now this is the important part. Whether you use some kind of stop block that sits in the fence or you just clamp something on, if you are using something small, you can keep these closed. If it is something much wider, mine are going to fit here, but for longer boxes, and this is what determines the length, you may have to open these up quite a ways. And this is the kind of maximum you can get by putting your stop block either out to here or clamping on here. And that's the limitation of the table. For a box this size, I can just keep this closed. I'm totally fine there. There have been times when I've had both of these spread all the way out. I don't love doing it, but you can do it. For this, you're gonna wanna twist your bit now parallel to the fence, and we can kind of get an eyeball there and then look under, and I just tilt like this. And like I said, I'm looking not only here, but also slightly down, and then I'm gonna lock that in. It's always better to undershoot this, and then we can move this back if we need to. Our very first cut is gonna be extremely light just to see our placement. You're now gonna do the exact thing for the opposite side. At this point, everything is set up. We may have to make some fine-tune adjustments, but this is essentially the plan. We're gonna go ahead and lower this back down to flush, and then we're gonna raise it just a hair, 1/64, something like that. We don't need our first cut to be deep. This is just to make sure everything is in alignment, and we also just can then kind of score the outside surface and it will work well. Now here's how this works. You're essentially gonna come back here and you're gonna butt this up against this guy right here. And then we are going to plunge down slowly with pressure. If you do this too fast or you're not holding this with the right amount of pressure, this thing will kick back up. If you take too big of a cut, it will kick back up. I've been in a hurry before and I've tried to take, 3/16, an eighth of an inch, and I've had this. Now, these generally help keep it from flying off, but it will kind of fly up and out if you're not careful. So you have to just hold this, and we're gonna plunge down. Once we've fully engaged and we've got the depth of cut set, we're then going to pull it across. And now we're here, there's two options. One, hold it down with one hand, turn your router table off, and wait for it to fully stop. I try to do that most of the time. Other times, I just grab this guy out here. Obviously a little more dangerous, but there are some people who are gonna do that. Just make sure that if you're gonna do it this way, you only grab way out here and just fold up like that. You will then repeat the process with the next piece, and only then will you change the depth bit height. I'm gonna now demonstrate this. This will be in real time speed. Nothing is going to be sped up here, so you can see how kind of slow and deliberate I move things along to avoid any concerns about kickback. I'm pretty happy with that. I got my alignment pretty much correct on either end here. I undershot the top line a little bit. I basically took out the bottom line instead of splitting them evenly, but it's close enough. At this point then, a 1/16 of an inch, at most 3/32 height at a time. If you push it to 1/8, you're really risking either some kind of rotational kickback if you're not careful, or blowing these bottom figures out, especially if they're this thin. We'll then need to, I'll say need, but then I generally square these off with a chisel delicately. So once you've done your one side, one half of it, in this case the long side, we've done both of these long sides at the same time. Every time we raise our bit, we take a plunge with both of them, etc., etc. You can then reposition these to do the short sides. And it is the short pieces that really I always come to the router table for doing these. I just can't, there's not enough reference surface to do this with a plunge router, maybe a tiny trim router, but that gets a little sketchy. Obviously, you get into a very tiny space here moving over, but it works really well as long as you keep pressure inward and then go downward slowly. Now, I would warn for those who have dust collection below the table, if you start cutting off that hole there, when you get close down, it can really want to yank it down in there, which can be dangerous. So you've got to make sure you are in control the entire time, or else it will fling that thing right into the router bit due to the extreme suction, especially if you're pulling from a proper dust collector. At this point, I then come in with a chisel and very delicately just square this off. Don't go too hard or you can blow right through, all the way through that whole thing right there. Any kind of roughness on the inside here is hidden. The other finger will cover that up, so it doesn't have to be the cleanest thing in the world. Just square that off so then when you go to cut your base, you can measure it correctly between the two endpoints instead of trying to figure out where that curve of the circle hits. And then that's exactly how I do box joints on the router table. Now for pieces that are too long for the router table, or if you don't have a router table to do the plunge method, I just plunge straight from above with a plunge router. It can be a trim router, plunging, whatever you want to do. It's the same layout method. We got our kind of lines of where we'd like to go. Then we've got the 1/4 inch depth, or whatever the depth is that your base would like to sit in. We pre-score those again as well to prevent tear out and blowing out the fingers, which absolutely can happen if you go too fast and are not careful. And then also one tip I have here is to pre-plunge both at the beginning and the finish, so that when you're going through, your cut ends before the end. Sometimes if you're going through and you're trying to stop dead center here, you can either overshoot it, which is absolutely possible, or just blow that entire finger out. If you come down, and you could do this with a drill too, I just find it's a lot more stable, or a drill press if you have that, to do it with the router. Just pre-plunge down at the end and at the start, and it'll make it a lot cleaner. So I'll just show you here how to do this. This is a big setup kind of thing. You have to have a way to hold this, and if you're using the Bosch router and edge guide, this is too thick for a piece of wood, this black part here. So you have to hang this off of the table, which means you then have to pinch it in there. And like I said, I have a whole setup because I do this enough that it just became easier to have a whole setup to go along here and run that. So this may or may not be useful to you depending upon whether you can set something up like this. But if you have this router, probably most edge guides, you cannot just have the piece of wood sitting on the table. Now, if you are doing this with a thinner piece of wood, which I do, take the other piece and just set it behind there. Obviously, I would move this back, and that'll double your reference area, and it will absolutely make it more stable if this is only like 2 inches or something like that. But I don't worry too much about the size of this. As long as your pressure is holding on to the inside, it's not going to fall off. Another tip I have is that oftentimes in the winter or even in the summer when it's super humid, the router doesn't want to slide super smoothly. Just paste wax the bottom of the router and the inside of the edge guide, and it will slide really well. Certain woods, it gets kind of caught up. It's not a smooth process, and we want this to be very smooth all the way through. I'm going to show you this in real time, step by step. I'm going to plunge full depth here, plunge full depth there, and then we can take a couple passes through the middle if we want. 1/4 inch deep is a bit much to be going in one pass with the router bit, but we're going to plunge full depth either way. So this is what it looks like. Relatively straightforward. It went very well. One thing you'll probably notice in watching that, and something you have to watch out for, is that when you get to the very end here, you obviously have no reference surface on the other side. So you have to make sure that the part of your edge guide that is on there is still making it parallel. You don't want to tip in like this. You can do it on either side accidentally. You can accidentally tip in like that, and it will be problematic. You also have to make sure that when you get to the end, you don't just plummet right off. This is all about holding it down and in and making sure you're in control of the router. If you do not, you will go right off the edge there, or just plunge in and you'll end up cutting out too much on the inside. But once you do it once or twice, it's really simple. You get a hang of it. It may be intimidating at first. Now at this point, you would just go ahead and chisel out whatever you needed to get rid of there to square that off. Mitered boxes are much simpler because whenever you connect these, you cannot see what's on the inside. This outside part is going to cover it. So we have two options here, either, at least that I prefer doing, either a groove where we float it, similar kind of look to the box joint we just walked through, or we can do a rabbet, rebate, whatever you want to call it, and then insert the bottom up and on, sitting in there instead of sitting in a groove. Now for this, I normally would use the table saw or a router table and spiral bit and just run it across and create the groove. Doesn't really matter what table saw blade you use, it's going to be hidden, so even if it's an alternating tooth bevel and it's not perfectly flat, as long as you go deep enough to get the desired depth you want, totally fine. You don't have to have a dado blade or a flat bottom blade to just seat a base inside of the groove. Now, the other option is the rabbeting bit. And like I said, ideally you want one with numerous bearings so you can choose the depth of this. But we can also do this on the router table using our fence to adjust the depth. And the difference is that when you're doing a groove, you have to put the lid in there amongst the glue up. It has to go internally. You can't put it in later. If you're going to do a rabbeting base, you can, if you want, put the base in later, in that it's going to remove a section that keeps this bottom open. So you can slide something up in there. You can do this either on the table saw or on the router table. You can do it laying down on the router table or vertically on the router table, however you want to do it. Now there is, if you have the bearing adjusted bit, a method of gluing together your entire box first, and then once it's glued together, you can then run the rabbeting bit around the edge and create whatever depth you want, and then just set the bottom into there. I don't have a bearing adjustable bit, but you would need one of those or else you're gonna have to take out a gigantic chunk all at one time, and that's not a good idea. So if you wanna do it that way, that's fine too, and save it for the end. I personally think the base kind of helps stabilize glue up. It just kind of prevents some things from slipping or anything on miters. I like putting it in there during the glue up. Cutting the groove or rabbet at the table saw is pretty straightforward, right? We're just running it through there at the desired depth over and over again until we get the width that we want for the base. My only kind of advice here is that I prefer to cut it with the groove on the outside to give me more reference surface here for the piece, and then also so that I'm farther away from my fence from the blade should I make some kind of mistake and move it. Some people like to cut it on the inside here. I like it on the outside. So that would mean the bottom of my box is facing away from the fence, the top is facing the fence. I make my initial bottom cut first, so the lowest point towards the bottom first, and then I can just move in from there until I get my desired thickness for the base. Now for our final method here, we would use the slot cutting or rabbeting bit, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially taking a straight bit and turning it vertically in the way that it cuts. So we're still just cutting a groove or a rabbet just with the piece against the fence. Some people prefer it this way. I find for doing rabbets, it's a little quicker this way. I don't do many rabbets. Instead of using a straight bit and going down, I can just take out chunks at a time of this. Obviously, if you have a feather board, that's nice here. You don't have to have one, but it's just going to keep even pressure. And otherwise, there's not really a huge difference here. You can also run into issues depending upon the depth that you want, because the bearing is only so deep. You only get about a little under ½ inch, 3/8, something like that on a bit like this. Now for me, that's way deeper than I'd ever need to go for a bottom base to a box, but you may want to go deeper, in which case you would need a much larger slot cutting bit, rabbeting bit, whatever you want to call it. So I will just show you how this works real quick for a rabbet. With your router unplugged, the way I like to set this up is to start with my ruler and just back to the bearing. And then from there, I like to lock down one side. I'm at a slight angle here. And then I can come in, and my ruler has a measurement going this way. And then I can kind of adjust this for my depth. You can use setup blocks for this as well. I just find that to be the easiest method of getting the depth correct, because obviously with this flat side here, you'd run into it. You can't just put a ruler in there and really see. It's easier to come from this way with a ruler that has some kind of measuring on this side. Just make sure it's unplugged and you're good to go. And there you have it, all in a single pass. I have removed all that material. It's very nice and stable, flat, clean. If you're doing a lot of them or you're taking out big chunks, these bits work pretty well. Some people like it over the straight bit. I'm still fine with the straight bit, and certainly I prefer the table saw over the router table in any case where I can use it. There are plenty of cases where the router table is your only option. So in that sense, I would just do this on the table saw, but it works great on here too as well if you like this setup or you have this setup and you'd rather do it on there. That's going to do it for today, and hopefully you've learned something. There are plenty of other ways to put bases into boxes. These are just the 3 main methods I use, plus the rabbeting, which I don't use very often. It's been a long time. I like to float my bases in grooves, whether it's with the table saw for the miter or the router table or router plunge base for the box joints. All I'll add is that if you are going to put a base inside of a groove and you are going to use solid wood, you have to have a little extra room on either side widthwise for that wood to expand and contract. And the only glue you should apply, if any, should be on the length side directly in the center on either end. Do not apply any on this side or this side. You need to allow it to expand and contract. It's the only problem with grooved bases. You have to remember that if you're using solid wood. Other than that though, no other real concerns about them. I think they work great. Let me know if you have any questions, and if you have any other ways that you prefer to do bases, go ahead and let me know. All right, have a good one.